A single drop of blood. That was the promise. One tiny sample, taken from a fingertip, could unlock hundreds of answers about your health. No long needles, no waiting rooms, no expensive lab process, no fear. Just a small device, a simple test, and a future where healthcare felt faster, cheaper, and more accessible. It sounded like the kind of idea that could change medicine forever, and that is exactly why so many people wanted to believe it. Theranos was not selling a normal product. It was selling relief. Relief from painful blood draws, relief from expensive testing, relief from a healthcare system that often felt slow, confusing, and out of reach. The company's message was powerful because it touched something deeper than technology. Everyone has a body. Everyone has fear. Everyone wants answers. And Theranos claimed it could give people those answers with only a few drops of blood. That was the magic. But magic is dangerous when people stop asking how it works. Because behind the clean white labs, the black turtlenecks, the famous investors, and the billion-dollar valuation, there was one question that mattered more than anything else. Did the machine actually work? This is the question at the center of Theranos. Not whether the idea was inspiring. It was. Not whether the vision was attractive. It was. Not whether the story was powerful enough to raise money, gain attention, and impress some of the most influential people in America. It clearly was. The question was simpler. Could Theranos do what it said it could do? That question turned a medical startup into one of the most famous corporate scandals in modern history. And to understand how it happened, you have to understand why the story was so believable. Theranos arrived in a world that was ready for disruption. Silicon Valley had already changed communication, shopping, entertainment, transportation, and the way people lived online. So why not healthcare? Why couldn't a young founder build a machine that made blood testing smaller, faster, and more convenient? Why couldn't medicine have its iPhone moment? That comparison mattered, because technology startups are often built on a simple belief. The old system is broken, and a new company will rebuild it. Theranos fit perfectly into that belief. Traditional blood testing seemed old. Labs seemed slow. Healthcare seemed inefficient. And Elizabeth Holmes presented herself as the person who would fix it. She was young, focused, intense. She spoke in a calm, controlled way. She dressed in a way that made people think of Silicon Valley's greatest founders. And she had a mission that sounded almost impossible to criticize. Making healthcare cheaper, making testing easier, giving people access to information about their own bodies. Who would be against that? This is one of the reasons Theranos became so powerful. The dream was morally attractive. It was not just about making money. It was about saving lives. And when a company connects itself to something that important, people can become less skeptical. Investors do not feel like they are just funding a startup. They feel like they are funding the future. Partners do not feel like they are just signing a business deal. They feel like they are joining a revolution. The public does not feel like it is watching another company grow. It feels like it is watching history happen. But healthcare is not the same as software. If a social media app breaks, people get annoyed. If a streaming platform fails, people cancel. If a blood test is wrong, the consequences can be serious. A medical company is not only selling convenience, it is selling trust. Trust that the result is accurate. Trust that the machine has been tested. Trust that the people behind it understand the responsibility. Trust that the promise is not moving faster than the science. And that is where Theranos became dangerous, because the company's story was moving faster than the proof. The public image was clean. The pitch was simple. The vision was enormous. But inside any medical testing company, the truth has to live in the data, not in the pitch deck, not in the founder's confidence, not in the valuation, in the data. A blood test either works or it does not. A machine is either accurate or it is not. A diagnosis is either reliable or it is not. There's no branding strategy that can replace that, at least not forever. Theranos built its reputation around a machine that was supposed to change everything. A compact device that could run many tests from a tiny blood sample. The idea sounded elegant, almost cinematic. A small machine on a lab counter, quietly doing what entire laboratories used to do. That was the image people wanted to believe. But technology is not real because it looks futuristic. It is real when it performs. Again, and again, and again, under pressure, under review, under conditions that do not care about the story. This is where the gap began. On one side, Theranos had a world-changing narrative. On the other side, it had a medical reality that could not simply be wished into existence. And the more valuable the company became, the more dangerous that gap became. Because every new investor, every new partnership, every glowing article, and every public appearance raised the cost of admitting the truth. Once a startup is small, failure can be painful. But once a startup becomes a symbol, failure becomes a threat to everyone who believed in it. That is when pressure grows. Not just pressure to succeed, pressure to maintain the image of success. Theranos did not become a scandal overnight. It became one step at a time. One promise, one presentation, one partnership, one moment where the story needed to keep going, even when the science had not caught up. And that is what makes the case so important. Theranos was not just a failed medical startup. It was a warning about what happens when confidence becomes a substitute for evidence, when a founder's vision becomes more persuasive than the machine itself, when powerful people want to believe so badly that they stop asking the most basic question, does it work? Because in the end, that was the only question that mattered. For a while, the belief around Theranos kept growing. The company attracted attention, money, and powerful names. It was not just another startup trying to sell a device. It was becoming a symbol of what Silicon Valley wanted to believe about itself, that a young founder could challenge an old industry, that speed could beat bureaucracy, that vision could outrun doubt, and that a product that looked impossible today might become obvious tomorrow. This is the kind of story investors love, because the biggest returns often come from companies that sound unrealistic at the beginning. The danger is that sometimes the language of innovation makes people forget the difference between difficult and impossible. A hard problem can be solved. A fake solution can only be protected. And the more attention Theranos received, the harder it became to separate those two things. The company's board and supporters gave it credibility. Important people were connected to the story. Big names made the dream feel safer. If powerful, experienced people believed in Theranos, then maybe the doubts were just noise. That is how trust can spread, not through proof, through association. A respected name creates comfort. A famous investor reduces suspicion. A polished founder makes uncertainty feel like genius. A beautiful mission makes criticism feel almost cynical. But medicine does not work that way. Blood testing is not a popularity contest. Accuracy does not improve because a board is impressive. A machine does not become reliable because investors are famous. And a patient's health does not care how good the story sounds. Inside the company, the pressure was different from the public image. Outside, Theranos looked clean, confident, and inevitable. Inside, the promise had to survive contact with reality. Machines had to run. Samples had to be processed. Results had to be accurate. And employees had to live with the difference between what the world was being told and what the technology could actually do. That is where the tension became dangerous. Because when a company is built on secrecy, even legitimate questions can start to feel like threats. If someone asks for proof, they can be treated as disloyal. If someone points out a problem, they can be seen as slowing the mission. If someone says the machine is not ready, the story may demand that they stay quiet. This is how a culture can shift. At first, secrecy can sound strategic. The company says it is protecting intellectual property. It says competitors are watching. It says the technology is too important to expose too early. And sometimes, that may be true. But secrecy becomes dangerous when it protects the image more than the invention. Theranos needed the world to believe the machine was revolutionary. But belief alone could not run a blood test. The company made the promise feel simple. A few drops of blood, many answers. But behind that simplicity was an extremely complex scientific challenge. Blood is not just a symbol. It is messy, variable, and difficult. Testing it accurately requires precision, validation, and discipline. Small errors can become serious. Different tests require different methods. And when you shrink the sample size, you do not automatically shrink the difficulty. You may actually make the problem harder. That is the part the public rarely sees. A great pitch can make a medical breakthrough sound inevitable. But a lab does not care about inevitability. A lab cares about measurement, and measurement is unforgiving. If the sample is too small, if the machine is inconsistent, if the data does not match, if the result cannot be trusted, the whole promise begins to crack. For Theranos, those cracks eventually became impossible to hide. The company had built an image of certainty, but the reality behind medical testing was full of questions. How many tests could the machine really run? How accurate were the results? How often were traditional machines being used instead? How much of the public story matched the private reality? These questions became more important as Theranos moved from pitch rooms into places where real people could be affected. This is the difference between hype and harm. A startup can exaggerate in a pitch deck and still only disappoint investors. But when a healthcare company exaggerates, patients may make decisions based on information they believe is true. That raises the stakes. This was no longer just about whether Theranos could become a successful company. It was about whether people could trust the results connected to their health. And once that trust is in question, the entire business becomes fragile. Because a medical testing company has only one real product: confidence. Confidence that the test is accurate. Confidence that the result means what it says. Confidence that the company is being honest about its limits. Without that, the machine is just a box. The clinic is just a room. The valuation is just a number. And the mission is just a story. The problem for Theranos was that the story had become enormous. It had attracted investors, partners, media attention, and public belief. When a small experiment fails, it can be corrected quietly. When a billion-dollar promise fails, the world notices. And the Theranos promise was not small. It suggested that one company could reshape blood testing, challenge major laboratories, and give people control over their health through a tiny sample. That is a powerful idea. But powerful ideas can become dangerous when they are treated as true before they are proven. This is where the investigation became critical. The public did not need another inspirational profile. It needed evidence. It needed people willing to ask uncomfortable questions. It needed to know whether the miracle was real. And when reporters and whistleblowers began challenging the story, Theranos faced a different kind of test. Not a blood test, a truth test. Could the company explain the gap between the dream and the data? Could it show that the machine worked as promised? Could it survive scrutiny from people who were no longer dazzled by the founder, the mission, or the valuation? For companies built on trust, scrutiny is the moment of truth. If the foundation is strong, questions can make the company stronger. But if the foundation is weak, questions become the beginning of collapse. Theranos had sold the world a future where a tiny blood sample could change healthcare. Now the world wanted proof, and proof is much harder to manufacture than belief. When the questions became public, the image started to break. Theranos had been built on confidence. Confidence in the founder, confidence in the mission, confidence in the idea that the old healthcare system was about to be disrupted by a small machine and a few drops of blood. But confidence is fragile when it depends on secrecy. Once people began asking how the technology actually worked, the company could no longer survive on vision alone. The story needed evidence, and evidence was exactly where the problem was. For years, Theranos had made people imagine a future where blood testing was simple, fast, and almost painless. That future was beautiful. It was easy to understand. It was easy to sell. But medicine is not built on beauty. It is built on accuracy. A blood test result can change what a patient believes about their body. It can create fear. It can create relief. It can influence treatment, follow-up appointments, and life decisions. That is why this case is different from a normal startup failure. If a social app fails, users lose time. If a delivery app fails, customers lose convenience. If a medical testing company fails, people can lose trust in information about their own health. That is a much deeper kind of damage. And when the truth began coming out, Theranos was no longer just a story about ambition. It became a story about responsibility. The company had not only sold a product, it had sold certainty. It had told the world that its technology could do something extraordinary. And the more extraordinary the claim, the stronger the proof needed to be. But instead of proof, the public saw questions. Questions about the machine. Questions about the tests. Questions about what was really happening inside the lab. Questions about whether the company's image had been protected more carefully than its science. That is when trust collapses. Not all at once. First, people doubt the details. Then they doubt the leadership. Then they doubt the product. Then they doubt the entire story. And once that happens, every old promise starts to look different. The black turtleneck stops looking like focus. The secrecy stops looking like strategy. The famous investors stop looking like validation. The billion-dollar valuation stops looking like proof. Everything that once made the company feel powerful begins to feel like part of the illusion. That is the brutal thing about a trust-based business. When people believe, every detail supports the story. When people stop believing, every detail becomes evidence against it. Theranos was eventually exposed not because the idea was unattractive, but because the gap between the idea and the reality became too large to hide. The dream was simple. One drop of blood, hundreds of answers. The reality was much harder. Machines, validation, data, regulation, accuracy, and scientific limits. The dream moved fast. The science did not. And that gap destroyed the company. But the lesson is not that big ideas are bad. Big ideas matter. Healthcare does need innovation. Testing can be improved. Patients deserve better access, better prices, and better experiences. The tragedy of Theranos is that it attached a real need to a promise it could not prove. And when a company does that, it does more than fail. It poisons trust around the problem it claimed to solve. Because after Theranos, people did not just ask whether one company had lied. They asked how so many powerful people believed it, how investors missed it, how partners accepted it, how the media celebrated it, how a story became stronger than the evidence beneath it. That is why Theranos belongs in the cost of trust. Because this was not only a medical scandal, it was a trust machine. The company converted belief into money, belief into partnerships, belief into reputation, belief into silence. And for a while, belief was enough to make the company look unstoppable. Until it wasn't. Because in the end, healthcare does not run on belief. It runs on proof. A machine either works or it does not. A test is either reliable or it is not. A result can either be trusted or it cannot. No founder, no board member, no investor, and no headline can change that forever. Theranos sold a medical miracle before it could prove the miracle was real. And once the world understood that, the company's greatest asset became its greatest weakness. The same trust that had built Theranos became the force that destroyed it. Because when trust is earned with evidence, it can survive pressure. But when trust is borrowed from image, status, and storytelling, it collapses the moment reality pushes back. Theranos promised to make blood testing smaller, but the scandal revealed something much bigger. How easily people can confuse confidence with competence. How easily a beautiful mission can hide a broken machine. And how dangerous it becomes when the people asking for proof are treated like obstacles instead of safeguards. That is the final lesson. In business, storytelling can open doors. In medicine, evidence has to walk through them. Theranos had the story. It had the attention. It had the powerful names. It had the billion-dollar dream. But it did not have the one thing that mattered most: proof. And without proof, every promise eventually becomes a liability. Theranos did not just run out of money. It ran out of trust. This was the cost of trust. If you want more stories about companies that sold a dream, earned belief, and left someone paying the price, subscribe. In the next case file, we will look at FTX, the crypto empire that collapsed the moment trust disappeared.